Hi, this is Claudia Carella, and today we are tackling one issue at a time. We are joined by Professor Erik Jones, Director of the Robert Schuman Centre here at the European University Institute. Welcome, Erik. So today we're going to tackle the future of Europe. And I want to start with the question, what is the state of the European Union now? In particular, I would like to ask you, where do you think that, in which areas do you think that Europe is driving innovation? And on the other side, where do you think our democracies are struggling more?
I think the European Union is driving innovation just by its very existence. If you were to look at the European Union and then imagine creating such a construct in any other part of the world, it would be really hard to accomplish. They have found a way to bring so many different countries together to tackle so many different problems at the same time. It's actually quite amazing. And while people like to look at the European Union and say it's punching below its weight at the global stage, the fact of the matter is, if it were just individual European countries, they would have very little weight at all. So that's, I think, where it's ahead. Where the European Union is struggling right now has to do with the fact that the European Union cannot remain static in terms of its size. It has to grow. It has to grow for reasons that have to do with European security. But to do that, the European Union will also have to evolve. It needs to change its internal institutional design, its decision-making procedures. It's going to have to develop some workarounds on procedures that simply cannot be changed. That's all going to be very challenging. And the next commission is going to be a commission that has to focus on those tasks, enlargement and institutional reform first and foremost.
How do you envision Europe's trajectory in the near future, especially regarding two major issues? On one side, security, and on the other side, environmental sustainability.
So let's do the environmental sustainability piece first. Obviously, the European Union needs to become much more sustainable and much more resilient. And they have the recovery and resilience funds that are helping to build out the infrastructure to make that possible. But what they really need is industry, and they need productivity. They need to have some way to compete at the global level in producing the kinds of technologies that will be necessary to drive the society of the future. I think that is the major challenge that Europeans are going to have to face. And in combating that challenge, they're going to have to invest an enormous amount of time, energy, and money. As for security, that's a whole different order of magnitude. The Europeans used to be able to rely on NATO to provide their security. It's not clear they can rely on NATO to the same extent anymore. And for Europeans to rise up to the challenge of providing security by themselves without the support of the United States, that's a challenge I don't think Europeans have thought about in over 75 years. We're going to have to rethink fundamentally what Europeans are willing to do together, how they're willing to procure their weaponry, how they're willing to train, and whether they're at all willing to project force. These are our fundamental questions, and I'm not sure Europeans have a sense of what the answer will be.
And speaking of security, Europe has largely avoided large-scale conflict for the past decades. But now with the invasion of Ukraine and the Middle East conflict, Europe has found itself with conflict at its doorsteps. Do you think that the European Union is equipped to navigate these challenges?
I mean, the short answer to that question is no. Europe is not prepared. But that doesn't mean Europe hasn't been confronted with the likelihood of this for quite a long time. Think about the violent collapse of Yugoslavia and all of the conflict that was on Europe's doorstep in the 1990s. Then think about the global war against terror and the terrorist attacks that took place in London, in Paris, Istanbul, and in Madrid. Europe has been facing violence for a while. The fact that we're seeing this violence on a much larger scale now is one that everyone should have anticipated, going all the way back to 2008 with the Soviet invasion or the Russian invasion of Georgia, and 2014 with the annexation of Crimea. What Europeans have to do is to figure out how they're going to mobilize themselves as a military capability, how they're going to forge an effective foreign policy, particularly with all the national vetoes involved. I think that's a challenge that Europeans are going to have to face, and it doesn't look like they're up to it right now, but that doesn't mean they won't be. it just takes a lot more effort than we'd like to have to put into it.
Let's move on to Europe's relation with the US. How do you see the transatlantic partnership shifting, especially in light of the upcoming American elections and with Donald Trump being a candidate in the elections?
I mean, I wish I could say that what's going on in the transatlantic relationship right now all boiled down to one individual, Donald Trump. With a colleague, Veronica Angel, we've just published an article in Political Science Quarterly that looks at the transatlantic relationship and takes a long view. And what we discover is that although Europeans and Americans share many values, probably more values are in common across the Atlantic than between any of the two regions in the world. The fact of the matter is that the way our economies are functioning, the way our foreign policies are functioning, and the way our priorities are being set are not identical across the Atlantic. On the contrary, they are diverging. And in that diverging set of priorities, there is inevitably going to be tension, a lack of cooperation, potentially even conflict, not the kind of violent conflict that we see between Russia and Ukraine, but conflict over what the priorities are in a transatlantic relationship. And without a smooth transatlantic relationship, the ability of either Europeans or Americans to assert global leadership is significantly diminished. So I think this is a really important question that you're asking, and unfortunately the answer is things are not headed in the right direction unless there is positive change on both sides of the Atlantic, whoever wins the elections in the United States.
And finally, do you think that the multitude of crises and geopolitical instability of the recent years prompted a reckoning for Europe and the West, especially on their role in the global stage?
So I think you're right to point out that Europe has had many crises. And Europeans like to roll their eyes and say, oh yeah, Europe is forged in crisis, with the idea that each crisis points Europe in the same direction. Fortunately, that's not how it works. Each of these crises has actually pushed Europe in very different directions. Think about the COVID crisis and the war in Ukraine, the full-scale Russian invasion in Ukraine, for example. The COVID crisis brought Europeans together in solidarity with one another, not initially, but after some effort was put into it. The war in Ukraine is not doing that. There is solidarity with Ukraine, but there are big strategic differences across the European Union that will need to be addressed. And when I think about whether Europe has turned the corner as a result of crisis, my answer is, well, no, it's still trying to pick up the pieces that each of these crises shook off the bus, and then it's going to decide where Europe is heading, or rather, then Europeans are going to decide where Europe is headed. And they need to make that decision sooner rather than later because the challenges they face are tremendous.